Welcome everybody for our discussion of section 2 in the reading of this book, What Money Can't Buy by Michael J. Sandel. We're going to discuss a few things relating to incentives. For Sandel, incentives are part and parcel of how markets operate, and the presence of incentives, for him at least, suggests that market values are encroaching upon things where they might not necessarily have markets values encroach upon. The first item he talks about is the incentives for sterilization, and he refers to this particular situation as something that could have benefit. There's certain amount of utility, at least in the person who's offering incentives. There's reward for the person who might be accepting these incentives. Of course, they're being targeted for people who are lower income in particular, who might give up their right to reproduce for a particular cost. I think here, though, he kind of illustrates that, is this something that should be done? And he basically says market transactions are okay if you're buying something that should not be for sale. And if you are buying something that should not be for sale, like for example sterilization or other items related to biologicals that we'll talk about a little bit later, is this not indeed something that we would refer to as corruption if you're buying something that's not for sale? He draws a comparison between that and buying for a judgment that a judge might offer. Certainly that would be considered a corruption because it's not something that should be for sale. And then from there he goes on to talk a little bit about how markets work, and markets are allocating goods based on preference, not on what is worthy. And this is kind of setting up his whole debate for this particular section, where he starts to get at one of his main ideas, that if you were to look at all of this discussion in the philosophy books and follow it in the discussions in the journals, you'd see is really an argument between utilitarianism, which is the market model where things have a particular utility and that's why they are done, versus idealism and the idea that things in themselves are valuable, like truth, for example, and that as a result they shouldn't be bartered away or sold at a bargain price or what have you. They are inherently valuable. And these are the two things that are coming up into contact with each other. If we back up here, Gary Becker, who's a leading proponent of the Chicago School, which is very much Chicago School of Economics, very much into the notion that everything should be bought and sold, that there are economic answers for every decision that we make on a day-to-day basis, that economic thinking is in essence rational thinking because it is taking into consideration the utility of every item that you might buy or sell, and everything is then attributed a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and you can make a decision your whole life, everything in your life, based on those kinds of cost-benefit analyses. But that's favoring the notion of utilitarianism, that everything has to be useful in some way, shape, or form. He then goes on to talk about paying kids for good grades. On around in the page 53, he says, that particular approach has mixed results, in the same respect that sometimes you can pay kids and you get better results in terms of their being better students and getting better grades. Sometimes it doesn't work out. He also talks about how sometimes giving non-monetary incentives has exactly the same type of effect, so that you are maybe cooler if you are partaking in advanced placement courses or things of this nature, and that kind of coolness factor or cultural pressure, if you will, not economic pressure, has just as much influence as paying for good grades or incentivizing taking more difficult classes or something of that nature. He then starts to talk about health benefits, okay? And with the health benefits, he talks about how you can lower your insurance premiums if you have a good bill of health, and that this is in some way incentivizing, certain health outcomes. The same thing is with, quitting smoking. A big one that people like to write their papers on is about weight loss. And Sandel's basic retort to all of this is, why should we be incentivizing something that should be the attitude or anyways of people? Are we not, inciting people to take behavior that they should be doing anyway? And that when we provide external, stimuli or external reasons for them doing this, then in effect what we are kind of doing is displacing the internal motivation that should be there for why we should be doing things, all right, for moral reasons presumably, or for cultural reasons, and displacing those with outside external motivations. And it kind of, if you do that over a period of time, you lose the ability in the individual to really hold any kind of internal motivation or ideal or standard. This is where the idealism comes into play here again. The inability to hold that ideal or standard internally is something that is, for Sandel, of great importance when we're talking about health benefits, such as he is in this particular section. So then from there he goes and he talks about Becker, who he brings up again, and Becker's idea about the right to immigrate. All right, should that be something that you could pay for and make a market out of? And he goes to illustrate that indeed that has been the idea that has been sold, if you will, and that that this something too might be an instance of corruption, because the right of citizenship maybe is one of those things that again should not be sold, and therefore it's corrupting the meaning of what it means to become a citizen. And that, it's inherently unfair as well, because the way it's set up, you need to pay $50,000 or $500,000, whatever it was, and have your investment then pay dividends in the form of 10 jobs, and then you can essentially buy your way to become a citizen of the United States. So, for Sandel, I think he brings into question whether that's appropriate or not. And then he goes and talks about trading procreation permits in China. So here, with the one-child rule, you're only allowed one child. But, you can get essentially a buy-a-child permit that allows you to take advantage of this, limited number of children that are allowed to come into existence because of overpopulation in China, and that these permits then have had a market price placed on them. Is this not the same as essentially putting a price on the child, on the head of a child? And also on top of that, the price is being put on the act of parenting. For Sandel, these are things that, really stand outside of the market as being something that we typically see as morally appropriate. And also, these are topics that, if you can find information about them, are exactly the type of thing that we could look at in this particular paper. No market prior to the tradable procreation permits in China. What does that do? How does that devalue the notion or enhance the value of the notion of a child or the ability to become a parent? After that, he talks about pollution permits and says, this idea of trading pollution permits is again, perhaps incentivizing behavior that should be there anyways. And also, when you incentivize, through these permits, aren't you indeed, maybe, isn't that a little bit like letting people pay to litter? That you're paying for the ability to do something which normally, you shouldn't do anyways. So again, it gets back to that idea, as if it's undermining a norm that should be in place anyways, this has a corrupting effect. And this, by the way, this corrupting effect is one of the things that people like to talk about in terms of a change that comes about when something is, market norms or market values are brought to bear on it. So that's something you can keep in mind for your own paper. Finally, the last example he has from this section is paying to hunt a rhino or a walrus. And in both of these cases, it's talked about how there is utility that is gained, because presumably other rhinos and other walruses, or in the case of the walruses, also the Native Americans who are able to sell their permits because they're basically grandfathered in the the prohibition against hunting walruses. This is real merit and real utility that is encouraged by these acts of paying to hunt rhinos or walruses. But Sandel again is asking us: is this undermining the way that we should be thinking about animals, or for that matter, is it way we should be thinking undermining the way we should be thinking about hunting? I like to think for people who do this paper on hunting is think about the way that the early civilizations and societies regarded hunting and the kind of ritual sacred aspect of hunting that is in place there. Ask yourself, perhaps, in the in the move to create a market around hunting, if there isn't a different kind of valuation about hunting in itself. Certainly that sacred element seems to be lost in a lot of respects. And finally, towards the end of the chapter, there's a quote on page 91 that I think is pretty interesting. And it might be, the summary of this whole section, when he says, to decide whether to rely on financial incentives, we need to ask whether those incentives will corrupt attitudes and norms worth protecting. And for him, that I think is the essential questions. And if you can point to something that is a norm or a value that is somehow degraded or corrupting, then that's an important question to ask about whether markets should intrude. Because it's, for him, just like this issue of sterilization. Should that be something that a market comes to bear and have an effect on? So that's what to think about. A couple of different topics that are potential, topics for your paper to think about. Carry on and continue now on to section 3. Good luck.